I destroyed my parents' retirement and exposed their lies. Now they're begging me to save them, and then I never planned to post something like this on Reddit, but after what happened, I can't stop thinking about it. I'm sitting here at a cheap diner outside of Kansas City, picking at cold fries, trying to process everything that went down at my parents' retirement party. Maybe I'm crazy for sharing it, but honestly, I don't know where else to put this. It's one of those nights where my head won't stop spinning, and the weight of it all feels heavier than ever. I'm not here for karma or attention. I just need to get it off my chest before it eats me alive. My parents, Nancy and Victor, threw this huge party to celebrate their so-called golden years. They've lived in the same crumbling farmhouse for decades, somewhere outside of St. Louis. It used to have charm, but now it just feels like a place stuffed with old grudges and broken promises. They invited everyone they could think of, relatives we haven't seen since the last funeral, neighbors who barely wave anymore, even Victor's drinking buddies from the bowling league. My younger sister, Sierra, showed up an hour early, parking her shiny black SUV in the driveway like it was the guest of honor. That SUV, by the way, was the same one my parents gifted her 2 years ago, the same year they told me there wasn't a cent left to help with my hospital bills. I arrived early too, because Nancy had texted me asking if I could help set up. I should have known better, but I guess part of me still hopes they'll treat me like I matter. The second I walked through the door, the air felt off. Victor barely glanced up from his phone, just grunted that the drinks were in the garage if I wanted one. The house smelled like burnt coffee and cheap candles, and I swear I could hear the walls groaning under the weight of all the tension. I asked Nancy what she needed help with, but she barely looked at me. She was too busy scrolling on her phone, probably checking Sierra's latest social media posts about manifesting success, or whatever nonsense she peddles these days. The only thing Nancy said was to make sure Sierra's vegan cheese platter was on the right shelf in the fridge. I tried asking how she felt about retiring, thinking maybe we could have a normal conversation for once. She didn't even look up, just shrugged and said she hoped I wouldn't make a scene tonight. Like I was the problem. Like I hadn't spent my whole damn life trying to keep the peace while they played favorites with Sierra. I laughed it off, but it felt like a punch in the gut. Every room in that house held a memory of me being second best, and tonight was no different. By the time the guests started trickling in, the vibe was already unbearable. My Uncle Carl and Aunt Debbie arrived first, bringing some cheap wine and that fake cheer they always pull out at family gatherings. Neighbors I didn't recognize showed up with casseroles and store-bought cookies. Victor started pouring himself whiskey like the bottle was going to disappear. Every time I walked by him, he'd mumble something about ambition, making sure I heard him. Nancy floated around, gushing about Sierra's future and how she deserved every good thing that came her way. They talked about Sierra like she was royalty, and I was just some stranger they had to tolerate for the evening. The truth is, things weren't always this bad. When I was younger, I believed they loved me. But that changed after I got sick at 21. I needed surgery, something serious, not some outpatient thing. The insurance payout came through, enough to cover the bills and give me a shot at recovery. I never saw a dime. Nancy and Victor said they used it for family needs. I found out later that family needs meant remodeling the kitchen and helping Sierra get her first car. I was eating instant noodles and drowning in medical debt while they upgraded the dishwasher. They never apologized. They never even admitted it was wrong. I moved out as soon as I could scrape together enough for rent, but they kept pulling me back in, always with guilt, always with strings attached. About a year ago, Victor asked if I could help manage their retirement funds. "You're good with computers, Tyler. We trust you." That's what he said. What he meant was, do the work we don't understand so we can brag about it later. I set up everything, got them online access they'd never use, handled their accounts like a dutiful son. They gave me full control, signed the paperwork without even reading it. I guess they thought I'd always be the kid they could walk all over. So here we were. The party was in full swing. People were drinking too much, laughing too loud, pretending this family wasn't rotting from the inside out. Sierra went live on Instagram more than once, showing off the SUV like it was the star of the night. The playlist was stuck on some awful pop mix Nancy loved. I stayed near the patio doors, trying to stay out of the way, counting down the minutes until I could leave without it being obvious. But then Nancy tapped her glass with a fork, and I knew something was coming. Something ugly. Everyone gathered around, holding their plastic cups like they were at some royal coronation. Nancy smiled that tight, fake smile of hers and started talking about legacy and sacrifice. I stopped listening after the first few lines. I already knew where it was heading. And then she said it, in front of everyone. Our biggest financial regret was wasting money raising a son who never amounted to anything. The words hit like a slap. But she wasn't done. Victor added that I was a 32-year-old failure who still begged for handouts. Sierra laughed and said at least beggars have dignity, while I was just a parasite on family charity. The room went silent, except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I felt something shift inside me. A switch flipped, and I knew I wasn't going to take it anymore. I didn't plan to say anything, but after that speech, something inside me snapped completely. I let out this loud, genuine laugh that echoed through the house, startling everyone into an even deeper silence. People turned and stared at me like I'd lost my mind, but I didn't care anymore. I walked over to the drinks table, poured myself a generous glass of whatever whiskey Victor had been hoarding, and took a slow sip while the room held its breath. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady and louder than I expected. I said, "Family charity? You mean the pension fund I've been managing for you two? That fund is gone." The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, like the whole party froze in place. I could actually hear a neighbor's dog barking from across the yard because everyone inside was dead silent. Nancy's face went pale, like I'd slapped her in front of the whole crowd. Victor slammed his glass down on the table so hard that the liquor splashed onto his shirt. Sierra's jaw dropped open, her phone slipping from her hand as she stared at me in disbelief. I took another slow sip, savoring the moment, and said, "Maybe you should have thought about who you were screwing over before you handed over your future." I watched as the guests exchanged nervous glances, not sure if they should stay or slip out the back door. My Uncle Carl tried to break the tension by laughing awkwardly and saying, "Tyler's just messing around, right?" I turned to him, locked eyes, and shook my head slowly. No one spoke after that. Nancy's voice broke the silence first as she lunged toward me, yelling something I couldn't even process over the noise in my head. She grabbed for my arm, but I pulled away easily, stepping back and leaving her grasping at air. Victor started shouting at everyone to leave, his face red with rage, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the bottle he was holding. Sierra stormed past me, her face twisted in fury, and slammed the bathroom door so hard that a picture frame fell off the wall. I stepped out onto the porch, the night air cool against my face, and just stood there for a while listening to the chaos unravel behind me. I heard Nancy crying, Victor cursing about lawyers, and Sierra yelling into her phone, probably trying to figure out how to spin the disaster for social media. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel like I ruined anything. I felt like, for the first time, I'd finally done something that mattered. I ended up crashing on the guest bed because I didn't have it in me to leave that night. I figured they wouldn't want me there, but nobody told me to go, maybe because they were too shocked or maybe because they hadn't figured out their next move. I got maybe 2 hours of restless sleep before Victor started pounding on the door, his fist thudding against the wood so hard it sounded like it might break. He was yelling at me to get up, saying I had to fix what I'd done, that I had ruined everything. I ignored him at first, but when Nancy's voice joined his, shrill and desperate, I knew the piece was over. When I finally opened the door, the house smelled like stale booze and cold coffee. Sierra was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone like she hadn't just watched our family implode the night before. Her eyes were red and puffy, but she tried to act like she didn't care, sniffling in this way that made it seem like she was on the edge of another outburst. Victor stood by the fridge with his arms crossed, trying to look tough, while Nancy clutched this old photo album like it was going to save her from the storm she helped create. Nancy launched into this speech about family and loyalty, saying I owed them for everything they'd done for me, how they only ever tried their best. She flipped through pages, pointing at pictures of me as a kid, trying to guilt me with memories that didn't mean anything anymore. I just sat at the table, letting her ramble, watching her desperation build. When she shoved the album toward me, I pushed it right back without saying a word. Victor's face went red with anger, his voice rising as he threatened to throw me out if I didn't make this right. I asked him what making it right meant to him, and he just shouted the same thing again, louder this time, like volume could bring the money back. Sierra finally spoke, not looking up from her phone, saying maybe she'd finally end up homeless like she always threatened when things didn't go her way. I ignored her because I had no energy left for her games. Nancy's voice cracked as she demanded to know if I was really going to let them lose everything after all they'd sacrificed. I looked her in the eye and told her the truth they refused to hear, that all they ever did for me was steal from me when I was at my lowest. She slammed the album shut, shoving it off the table, and Victor stormed off into the garage, slamming the door behind him so hard the walls rattled. The house was filled with this heavy, suffocating silence as I sat there, waiting for the next move. Nancy stared at me with this mix of hatred and heartbreak, like she couldn't decide whether she wanted to scream or beg. I pulled out my phone, opened the banking app, and showed her everything: the transfers, the withdrawals, the password she signed off on without a second thought. She kept searching my screen like she might find some magic button to undo it all. I told her she gave me the power because she thought I was weak, but it turned out she was wrong. She lunged at me, trying to slap me, but I blocked her easily. She hissed that I'd ruined her life and that no one would ever love me. I told her she could say whatever she wanted, but she was still broke. Then she stormed off, slamming her bedroom door so hard that I thought the frame might crack. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, listening to the house fall apart around me. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel relief. I just felt like the kid they'd always underestimated, finally standing on his own, and I wasn't about to back down now. I thought maybe after that morning, they'd finally see that the game was over. I figured they'd stew in their misery, lick their wounds quietly, and try to figure out what to do next without dragging me into it. I couldn't have been more wrong. It's wild how fast people like Nancy and Victor can go from acting like they don't need you to acting like you've destroyed their entire universe. By the time I walked out of that house with my bag slung over my shoulder, I could hear Nancy already on the phone, whispering and crying, probably to one of her sisters or some old neighbor. She was spinning the story, framing herself as the heartbroken mother who'd been betrayed by her ungrateful son. Victor stayed on the porch, nursing a beer like it could fix the mess they'd made. He didn't even look at me as I left. He just stared at the street like maybe some miracle would come walking up the driveway. I walked for a while, not even sure where I was going, just needing space to think. I ended up at this grimy coffee shop near the edge of town. I ordered something cheap and sat in the corner, watching as my phone started lighting up with messages. First it was Aunt Debbie, then Uncle Carl, then cousins I hadn't spoken to since high school. They were all concerned and just wanted to understand what was going on. I ignored them at first, figuring they'd lose interest once they realized I wasn't going to play along. But they didn't lose interest. If anything, the calls and texts only got worse. Nancy must have been working overtime because I was getting messages from people I hadn't thought about in years. People from school. People I barely remembered. Even old coworkers started reaching out, asking if it was true that I'd robbed my parents blind. The part that really got me was how fast the family chat exploded into existence. Victor created it, adding everyone he could think of, turning it into this digital courtroom where I was supposed to defend myself while they played judge and jury. His first message was all caps, calling me unstable, a liar, someone who was trying to destroy everything they'd built. Sierra jumped in almost immediately, calling me a thief, saying I'd manipulated everyone from the start. She posted this ridiculous, dramatic message on her private story about betrayal and snakes, clearly trying to get sympathy from the few people who still believed her nonsense. For a while, I just watched the messages pile up without saying a word. People were arguing back and forth, some defending me, others siding with Nancy and Victor, while a few stayed silent, probably waiting to see where the dust would settle. Then Charlotte, one of the few cousins I ever really trusted, messaged me privately. She asked if I had any proof, and I didn't hesitate. I sent her a few screenshots, nothing too detailed, just enough to show I wasn't making this up. Her only reply was, "Holy hell, I believe you." That gave me the push I needed. I dropped a couple of those screenshots into the family chat, account access forms, a few old messages where Nancy basically admitted to using my insurance money for things that weren't mine. The chat went dead silent for a moment, like no one knew how to respond. Then Aunt Debbie piped up with that classic line about how we shouldn't air dirty laundry in public, as if they hadn't already dragged me through the mud. Uncle Carl tried asking if there was any way to fix this quietly, like money would just magically reappear because they wanted it to. Sierra started spamming angry emojis, probably because she had nothing left to say. Nancy left the chat altogether, like that would somehow erase what I'd shared. Victor sent one last message saying I wasn't his son anymore, like that was supposed to break me. But honestly, it didn't. All I could think about was how for years, I'd carried the weight of being their disappointment, their scapegoat, and now they were the ones being exposed. I muted the chat and went back to my coffee, letting them argue amongst themselves. Charlotte messaged again, saying she was going low contact with everyone for a while because the drama was too much. I couldn't blame her. She was the only one who didn't try to guilt trip me or demand I clean up a mess I didn't make. The fallout kept spreading faster than I expected. Nancy started calling everyone she knew, from old friends to distant cousins, telling them I'd gone crazy, that I needed help, that I'd ruined everything they'd worked for. Victor tried to play tough, sending me messages threatening to expose me if I didn't return what I'd taken. I told him to go ahead, that I wasn't afraid of the truth coming out. He didn't reply after that, probably because he knew there wasn't anything left to expose except their own greed. Sierra tried calling late that night. At first, she didn't say anything, just sat there breathing into the phone like she couldn't decide if she was going to scream or sob. Finally, she said I always ruined everything, that she wished I'd never been born, that Victor was going to make this right no matter what. I didn't even bother arguing. I just hung up and turned my phone off for the night. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. The people who believed me didn't need more proof, and the ones who didn't never would, no matter how many receipts I showed them. I stayed at my friend's place, trying to keep my head down while they all imploded. Every day, more messages came through. Some relatives wanted to play peacemaker, telling me to be the bigger person, asking if I could just return enough to help them save their house. Others went straight for the throat, accusing me of being heartless, selfish, ungrateful. I sent screenshots when I felt like it, ignored them when I didn't. The house went up for sale within days, listed cheap with blurry photos that showed just how fast they were trying to unload it. The SUV that Sierra had paraded around was apparently worth less than they owed, and no dealer wanted it. Nancy made one last attempt at peace. She called, her voice cold and flat, offering to forgive everything if I just returned enough to help them keep their home. I told her to sell the SUV. She started yelling, saying I was heartless, saying she wished she'd never had me. I told her I was glad she'd finally said what she really felt. She hung up, and I stared at the phone, realizing that for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them anymore. Let them talk. Let them beg. Let them spin their stories however they wanted. I wasn't coming back. You would think after all that chaos, after the group chat blew up and relatives started blocking each other left and right, that maybe they'd finally let things go. I honestly believed they'd retreat, lick their wounds, and figure out how to clean up their own mess without dragging my name through the mud again. But Nancy and Victor weren't wired that way. They didn't know how to stop. They didn't know how to take the loss and move on. They just doubled down, like they always did, trying to pull everyone else into their misery so they wouldn't have to sit in it alone. It started with Nancy reaching out to people I hadn't seen or spoken to since high school, people who wouldn't even remember my face if I passed them on the street. I began getting friend requests from names I hadn't thought about in over a decade, followed by awkward messages asking if it was true that I'd stolen from my own parents. The worst part was realizing how fast Nancy had moved to paint herself as the poor, heartbroken mother abandoned by her ungrateful son. I didn't even bother responding to any of them. I just stared at the messages piling up and wondered how much more of this circus they planned to stage before finally admitting they'd lost. Meanwhile, Sierra was bouncing between acting like nothing was wrong and throwing out cryptic social media posts about betrayal, fake family, and haters trying to tear her down. She was crashing at a friend's apartment across town, still clinging to the last scraps of her image while everything fell apart behind the scenes. I heard through Charlotte that Sierra tried to offload the SUV back to the dealer, only to find out there was no equity left, that they owed more on it than it was worth, and no one wanted to touch it. Classic Sierra, always chasing the shine, never thinking about the bill that would eventually come due. The house went up for sale faster than I thought it would. No fancy listing, no professional photos, just some blurry shots that made the place look as sad and broken as the people trying to sell it. I swung by one afternoon, just to grab the last of my stuff before they could find some excuse to toss it out on the curb. Nancy wouldn't let me in at first. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes on the ground like if she didn't look at me, none of it would be real. I told her I could wait on the porch all day if I had to, and eventually she stepped aside, probably just wanting me gone as fast as possible. Inside, the house was chaos. Boxes stacked haphazardly, cabinets half empty with angry post-it notes stuck to them like warnings to stay out. A broken mug still sat on the floor where it had landed during their last fight, and the family photos that used to line the walls were either packed away or left in piles like they didn't matter anymore. Victor was out back, smoking and staring at the fence, refusing to even glance in my direction when I passed by. The air in the house felt heavy, like the weight of all their failures was pressing down on every inch of it. I grabbed my things quietly, packed them up, and didn't say a word until I was ready to leave. Nancy tried one last time, mumbling about how I should be ashamed of myself, how I was throwing away the only family I'd ever have. I told her to save it, that I didn't need the lecture, that I'd heard it all before. She slammed the door to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the wreckage. That night, Victor sent me one final message, asking for a loan, saying it was just to help them get back on their feet. I didn't bother answering. I didn't even open it at first. When I finally did, I just stared at it for a while and wondered if he even realized how pathetic it sounded. Nancy tried calling too, her voice stripped of any of the sweetness she used to fake so well. She said I'd regret this, that I'd end up alone and with nothing, that I'd ruin myself, not them. I told her the truth, that I'd been alone since the day they took that insurance money and left me to rot. She hung up without another word, and I felt nothing at all. The relatives who hadn't already blocked me started sending messages, trying to convince me to play the bigger person, to be the one to make peace, as if that was my responsibility after everything. I didn't bother arguing. I just sent the same screenshots as before and let them draw their own conclusions. Charlotte stayed in touch, the only one who seemed to really get it. She said she was cutting contact with the whole family for a while, that she couldn't stand the drama anymore. I believed her. She was always the one who saw through the nonsense, even when we were kids. What really struck me, what really drove it all home, was watching how fast Nancy and Victor's social circle evaporated. The neighbors stopped visiting. The old friends stopped calling. Even the people who used to hang on Nancy's every word at church or community events seemed to vanish overnight. Sierra's social media went quiet except for the occasional sad post about fake friends and betrayal, but nobody was lining up to offer her sympathy anymore. It was like they'd burned through every bridge they had, and now they were stranded on their own little island of self-pity. Nancy made one last attempt at a truce. She called me, sounding more desperate than angry for once, offering to forgive everything if I'd just return enough to help them keep the house. I told her again to sell the SUV if she needed cash. That sent her over the edge. She started yelling, calling me heartless, saying she wished she'd never had me, saying I was the biggest mistake of her life. I told her I was glad to finally hear the truth come out of her mouth. She hung up on me, and Victor followed with a string of profanity-laced texts that I didn't even bother to read all the way through. I'm not living large. I'm not on some tropical beach counting my money. I'm just crashing at my buddy's place, figuring out what comes next, working my regular job, trying to breathe again. But for the first time in a long time, I'm not scared of what's waiting around the corner. They can spin their stories, they can cry to whoever will listen, but I'm done carrying their weight. I know they'll keep trying to find a way back in, but they don't realize that door's been locked for good. Let them sell the house. Let them drown in the mess they made. I've got my life back, and they can't touch it anymore. I thought that once the house sold, once the SUV was gone, once their pride finally cracked, maybe they'd stop. Maybe they'd accept that they had nothing left to squeeze from me, that I wasn't coming back to save them no matter how many times they begged, threatened, or guilt-tripped. But I should have known better. People like Nancy and Victor don't know how to let go of control. When they lose it, they don't retreat. They regroup, they plot, and they look for new ways to drag you back into their chaos. It started small at first, like a storm on the horizon that I thought might blow past me. I got an email one night from an address I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it without reading it, figuring it was spam or maybe some leftover contact from their campaign of character assassination. But the subject line caught my eye. It just said, "I want to make things right." Against my better judgment, I opened it. It was from Sierra. The tone was completely different from anything I'd heard from her before. No insults, no bitterness, no talk of betrayal or fake family. Just this long, rambling apology where she claimed she was done with Nancy and Victor, that she saw now how toxic it all was, that she wanted to meet in person and explain things she should have told me a long time ago. She said she had information about money Nancy and Victor had hidden, about things they never wanted me to find out, about how she could help me end it for good. She begged me not to ignore her, promised it wasn't a setup, said she just wanted peace between us, that she was tired of carrying the weight of the lies they'd wrapped all of us in for years. I stared at that email for a long time, trying to decide if I believed even a word of it. Part of me wanted to hit delete and never think about it again. But another part of me, the part that still hoped maybe, just maybe, she really had changed, couldn't let it go that easily. I told her I'd meet, but only somewhere public. I picked this little cafe in Kansas City, a place I knew well, where I felt comfortable, where I knew the staff and could count on it not being some quiet corner where I'd be ambushed. The whole drive there, I kept telling myself not to let my guard down, not to fall for whatever game she was playing. But underneath that, I felt that stupid flicker of hope that maybe this was the moment everything really changed, that maybe she was finally done pretending. When I walked in, Sierra was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees. She looked different, tired, older somehow, like the last few months had drained all that smugness out of her. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. We sat in awkward silence for a minute before she started talking, saying all the things she'd written in the email, but with more detail this time. She told me about accounts Nancy and Victor had tried to hide, about plans they'd made to stash what little was left before anyone else could touch it. She said she didn't want any part of it anymore, that she was done being their puppet, that she just wanted peace. I let her talk, watching her carefully, waiting for the catch. And sure enough, it came. Just as I started to believe maybe she meant it, she slid an envelope across the table. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. It wasn't some list of account numbers or hidden assets. It was a packet of legal papers, papers from Nancy and Victor's lawyer, accusing me of theft, demanding repayment, threatening to take me to court if I didn't return everything. Sierra didn't even look ashamed. She just sat there, watching me with that same smirk I'd seen 100 times when we were kids and she'd gotten her way. She said they never wanted to hurt me, that they just wanted what was fair, that if I signed an agreement and returned most of what I'd taken, they'd drop it and move on. I felt this cold wave of anger wash over me, but I didn't let it show. I just smiled, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my phone. I'd been recording the entire conversation from the moment I sat down. I played it back, letting her hear herself admit that they'd set this up, that they'd hidden money, that she'd lied to get me here. Her face changed then, first shock, then fury, then that cold, hard mask she always wore when the game turned against her. I stood up, left the papers on the table, and told her I'd see them in court if that's what they really wanted. I walked out without looking back, my heart pounding, but my mind clear for the first time in weeks. They thought they could trap me again, that they could pull me back into their web, but they underestimated me one last time. I had what I needed to make sure they couldn't twist the story anymore. Later that night, I sent the recording to my lawyer, just in case, and I slept better than I had in months. I knew they wouldn't stop trying, not really. But I also knew I was done being the kid they could corner, done being the son who kept hoping for love that was never real. I'm not waiting for their next move. I'm building my own life, on my own terms, and if they want a war, they'll be fighting it alone. Let them drown in the lies they built. I'm done playing their game.